Hey there, welcome back. Hope that you had a good week. Hope that election anxiety has not totally consumed your entire life, but if it has, that makes two of us, so now you know you're not alone. But if you can summon the mental energy, I'm going to give you a quick recap, or preview rather, of our second unit in AP World History. We are going to call this unit the Early Modern Era. Different people have different dates that they use to bookend this, but that's a pretty common term in use among world historians as opposed to historians of a particular region, so it's what we're going to go with. And it spans a period from roughly 1450 to 1750. I am going to start by quickly trying to summarize the post-classical period from about 1200 until 1450, which is what the unit that we just wrapped up over the last 6, 7 weeks, in an attempt to emphasize to you both what you should have learned in the last couple months of your life and also what's going to be different about period two in AP World History. Um, there's two basic themes that I tried to hammer into your head over the course of Unit 1. The first is what the College Board likes to call the global tapestry, which is really just to say that there is a huge variety of state systems and their accompanying cultural, belief systems and social hierarchies across the world in the post-classical period. So we looked at a couple of really big bureaucratic centralized empires like China and like the Byzantines, which are the heirs of the Roman Empire. We looked at some trading based kingdoms that are geographically smaller but fabulously wealthy because they sit astride really important trade routes like Mali in West Africa, like Srivijaya in Southeast Asia. We looked at a number of religious states, in particular the caliphates that were established by the Prophet Muhammad and his successors, and then a number of other sultanates or other Islamic states that are established in the wake of the fall of the Abbasid Caliphate. And we looked at groups of pastoral nomadic peoples who aren't so interested in state building, who are interested in um, sort of trade relationships, or sometimes stealing stuff and raiding and trading relationships with settled agricultural peoples, with the Mongols being a huge exception as the one pastoral nomadic people that establishes a massive land empire. And we talked about feudalism and manorialism, which is a way of having decentralized political power common in much of Europe, although of course with important local variations. The other big theme that we talked about in Unit 1 is that the world is, although very different places are run very differently in terms of politics and social organization and culture, trade is an increasing source of interconnection across much of the post classical world. So the Silk Roads are an important overland trade route that ultimately connects Europe and East Asia with important political and cultural and economic effects for Central Asia as well. We talked about the Indian Ocean trade networks as being probably the most thoroughly trafficked of the time, and about the spread of religions and of cultures, and even the creation of the Swahili language as a result of the interactions facilitated by those maritime trade networks. You know also about some of the technologies, like understanding the monsoon winds, the development of the lateen sail, that facilitate more and more trade along that route. We talked about the trans-Saharan trade, which is conveyed primarily by camel caravans, which connects North and West Africa across the vast and inhospitable Sahara Desert, which gives an important role for pastoral nomadic peoples like the Berbers and others, which is a vehicle for the transmission of Islam into at least the elites of West Africa, and which is going to make people like Mansa Musa of the Mali Empire fabulously, unimaginably wealthy. We talked, of course, about the Mongols. We talk a lot about the Mongols. I'll never stop talking about the Mongols, even when it's no longer really time for us to be talking about the Mongols. And for these purposes, the way in which the political stability they established across such a big chunk of Eurasia really facilitated an increase in the volume of overland trade. And what is that where trade goes, where goods go, it is impossible to stop culture and technology and ideas from flowing. And so we see things like the transmission of Buddhism, the transmission of Islam. We see the spread of, say, Arabic numerals, which are really Indian numerals, but called Arabic numerals in the West because they're introduced by Arab traders from India. You know about the transmission of other technologies, and you know that belief systems aren't static, and especially when they move into different locations and cultural contexts as a result of trade in goods, they're also going to change. They're also going to blend with local cultures. They're also going to absorb ideas from new contexts, and you're going to see a whole lot of syncretism. One exception to this, which will change after 1450, is that the Americas remain separate from this Afro-Eurasian trade network. I'm going to try and probably not 100% succeed to avoid the terms Old World and New World, because geologically that doesn't make a whole lot of sense for Afro-Eurasia and for the Americas, respectively. But the Americas are going to remain both unknown and largely unknown and geographically separate from that much more integrated trade network in Afro-Eurasia that we've talked about. You know that there is some extent of trade between civilizations and societies in the Americas, but you also know that there are geographic obstacles that are going to reduce the extent and the intensity of that trade. But don't worry, it's going to change in period 2. Two turning points, because one could reasonably ask the question, why is it that 1450 is the mark, other than that it is a nice round number, and of course this is quite approximate. So two turning points that I want to identify. The one that you probably already knew and the one that you probably already talked about is depicted in this horrible piece of art, which is titled Christopher Columbus and the Discovery of America. And I hate it for aesthetic reasons because it looks like a low-quality video game cover, but I also hate it because somebody titled the painting that in 1993, and you honestly ought to know better. But of course, my condescension about this piece of art aside, you do need to know that Christopher Columbus is the first European who very definitely sailed to the Americas and established lasting contact. You need to know that he did that in 1492, and you need to be able to articulate the really, really, really significant consequences of that for the Americas and for Afro-Eurasia. But in order to understand where the early modern period comes from and what sets it apart, we actually need to go a little bit earlier to 1453, to an event that you're less likely to have heard of, which is the seizure of Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the Second Rome, the seat of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, by this fledgling upstart group of Turks known as the Ottoman Empire. Those are the two events. I don't spend a huge amount of time talking about specific events in a course that tries to cover 820 years of human activity in like 4 months. But these are two events that you need to know about because they are both pivotal turning points. So let's spend a little bit of time trying to talk about why you should care about those two precise dates, those two precise events. When the Ottomans seized Constantinople, you'll see Eurocentric views occasionally refer to this as the fall of Constantinople, but of course the Ottomans would put it differently. When the Ottomans seized Constantinople, that's going to have a couple of ripple effects. The Ottoman Empire is significant in its own right. We'll get into it over the next week or so. But also even from the perspective of the rest of the world, that's going to have a number of ripple effects. One is that there are a number of scholars living in Constantinople and living in the remains of the Byzantine Empire who will flee. Many of those people will end up in Italy, and their knowledge, their thought, and their writings, and particularly their access to older works that had been preserved by Arab and Muslim scholars generations previously, are actually going to they're going to give a nice kick in the pants to the Italian Renaissance and really enrich the culture and the scholarship of Europe and the technological development of Europe. The other thing is that there are Italian city-states, like Venice and Genoa being the most prominent, that had previously been really, really powerful and influential, and of course fabulously wealthy as a result of their active participation in trade in the Mediterranean Sea. But once the Ottomans take over Constantinople, and particularly the crucial strait between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea, those Italian city-states are going to lose some of their wealth, their influence, their power. Venice will actually sort of voluntarily submit itself to Spain in the hopes of military protection because these are really merchant states and not so much fighting states. And so that's going to change the political balance of power within Europe as well. If I zoom out on the map and in the scope of world history, a couple other things to note. One is that for anybody trying to facilitate either land or sea trade, for any merchant who's interested in trafficking goods between Europe and Asia, the spread of the Ottoman Empire, and specifically the control of Constantinople, which is a crucial choke point between the Mediterranean and the Black Seas, Ottoman middlemen are going to become increasingly powerful after 1453, and the Ottoman Empire is going to be able to charge much higher taxes on anyone who wants to bring goods to or from or between Europe and Asia via Constantinople. Constantinople. And so Ottoman middlemen are going to interfere with the flow of goods from the European perspective, and start getting involved more aggressively in trade. As a consequence, some Europeans, both merchants and states, will be kind of choked out of this trade or priced out of this trade. And that's going to be one major incentive for those folks to engage in the search for new maritime trade routes so that ultimately they'll be able to go around Africa, using important new technologies of navigation, and get into the Indian Ocean without having to go through Ottoman-controlled territory. That's going to be important when we get to the changes in the Indian Ocean world, which are an important feature of Unit 2. Finally, on an even more global scale, when we get to 1492 and Columbus's voyages, Columbus is incorrect when he thinks that he is going to circumnavigate the globe and find a westerly route to Asia. And you probably know from elementary school or from your own background knowledge, that Columbus is incorrectly thinks that he's in India, names them the Indies, and persists in this delusion for probably longer than he really had a right to. But Columbus showing up in the Americas is going to initiate relationships of trade, of conquest, and of biological exchange. And in particular, we'll spend some time on a phenomenon known as the Columbian Exchange, in which there is a two-way introduction of plants, of animals, of people, and significantly of germs from Afro-Eurasia into the Americas, and from the Americas into Afro-Eurasia. And that's going to have important consequences for indigenous populations in the Americas who don't have a lot of natural resistance to diseases that many people in Afro-Eurasia do. It's going to have significant consequences for culture. We're going to see all kinds of syncretism between indigenous American traditions, between European traditions, and between the traditions of Africans who are introduced largely forcibly into the Americas. And you're also going to see, plants, animals introduced to Afro-Eurasia in a way that will by and large be beneficial. And so you'll see populations in various places surge as, say, Europeans start growing potatoes, or Chinese start growing sweet potatoes, which are going to facilitate tremendous population growth in those places. It's not just the transatlantic trade that's significant in this period. There's also going to be an integration across the Pacific of direct trade between the Americas and Asia, facilitated in particular by two events. One is the one you're more likely to have heard of, is the Spanish discovery of silver mines, notably at Potosi in present-day Bolivia and elsewhere in its American colonies. But actually the more important driving factor is the decision by the governments of China during the Ming Dynasty to demand that everybody in China pay taxes in silver. And so suddenly there's a massive demand for silver in China, and the Spanish have the good fortune from their perspective of being able to sit on this world's gigantic supply of silver, and suddenly sell it to China. And so you'll see those patterns of expanding trade networks and of integration, cultural, social, economic through trade, expand to incorporate the Americas. And as you probably know, you'll see very, very differential consequences for different groups of people, defined not just by national origin, but also by social status. So, wrapping up, just to preview the really big themes that we're going to see in world history, because I am a 90s kid and I grew up going down the street to my friend Tim's house to play video games because his mom was more generous than mine, I think. I refer to this in my head as the Age of Empires, which is a really great video game that I think everybody should play, regardless of how low quality the graphics are by 21st century standards. And the two kinds of empires that you're going to notice and need to care about in this period are the ones on land and the ones on sea. We'll start off by talking about land empires, primarily in Asia and in the Middle East, a little bit in Europe as well. There's a group of three Muslim-led empires, the Ottomans centered in present-day Turkey, the Safavids centered in present-day Iran, and then the Mughals centered in present-day India, which historians sometimes refer to as the gunpowder empires because they had access and made really good military use of this fancy new technology of gunpowder, probably which they received from the Chinese by way of various trade routes, in order to build these fairly large empires, although I hasten to remind you, not as large as the Mongols. You'll also see the expansion of the Russian state in this period, and you'll see the introduction of a new dynasty, the Qing in China, and geographic expansion using similar technologies and strategies there. States are going to have to become bigger, not just geographically, but also in terms of their ability to administer, to tax the population, to deliver services, as a result of this new reliance on gunpowder. So there is a trend in Asian empires, especially towards consolidation into bigger states in this period, because running a sort of a small boutique empire is not going to work very well for you in the age of gunpowder. As those states expand, they face a need to consolidate their power and to legitimize their political authority, to tell the peoples that they've just conquered that they deserve to be in power. And so you'll see a bunch of different strategies that these new states or these expanding states will use in an attempt to establish themselves as the legitimate authority. Some of them will turn to religion, most of them will turn to religion, some of them will build big pieces of monumental art and architecture that still last today in order to try and impress people with their wealth and their cultural sophistication. They'll come up with different ways of rewarding social elites or of promoting new social elites that are loyal to the state. And so look for that to be an important task that all of these empires need to accomplish. And then finally, many of them will have different approaches to cultural difference. In other words, they're going to, as these empires expand, they're going to take in more and more populations that might not share the language or the ethnic identification or the national identity or, importantly, the religion of their conquerors. And so different empires will take different approaches to tolerating religion versus regulating religious minorities versus being okay with themselves being the religious minority ruling over a population that largely subscribes to a different belief system. And if you thought that there would be syncretism happening here, you are 100% correct. The other category of empires that we're going to concern ourselves with is maritime empires, those that expand by sea rather than over land. And that's primarily going to be Europeans in the Americas and Europeans getting increasingly involved in Indian Ocean trade. We'll talk a little bit about the new technologies or the diffusion of technologies that facilitate this. One of the most important is the introduction of armed trade into the Indian Ocean, which is really just European merchants putting guns on their boats and kind of shoving other merchants out, or at least forcing their way into the Indian Ocean trade. We'll talk about the Columbian Exchange, which is that biological exchange of plants, animals, germs between the quote Old World and the quote New World, or more properly, between Afro-Eurasia and the Americas. And we'll take a look at Europeans starting to build these colonial empires in the Americas as well. We'll think a little bit about the emergence of global trade networks, particularly in silver and in fur, and the way that they reshape the societies that participate in them. We'll take a look at what Europeans do when they muscle their way into the Indian Ocean trade. And I do want to flag for you that, with a couple of exceptions, European states are not colonizing large swaths of territory in Asia in this period. They're establishing what are known as trading post empires, where they take control of strategically located cities or forts along the Indian Ocean basin, but they're not expanding inland a huge amount yet. And that leads me to the last point I want to make about this period, which is that it's kind of common for people who don't necessarily think super hard about what they're saying. I've definitely fallen into this trap before. It's kind of common to say that 1492 is really the beginning of the age of European dominance. But I do want to caution you that by many measures, these large Asian land empires are wealthier and more powerful and more important and more technologically advanced than these kind of fledgling upstart backwater European empires that consist of little chunks of territory dotted all around the map of the world. And so we are going to see European states become much more powerful and influential in global politics and economics, but don't characterize this as the period in which Europe definitively takes over. You're going to have to wait until after 1750 for that. I will leave it there for now, and I'll look forward to talking to you about all of this when I see you next. Thanks.